We've seen for a while Alberta hesitating around investing in anything related to climate change. But CCUS is one of those tangible things that's not the solution to climate change. I think there's a role for provinces with surpluses and with the capacity to be investing in their future and their workers' future.
Welcome back. The Prime Minister pretty clear there in an interview with Reuters on what he'd like to see from Alberta. This as Ottawa says it plans to move ahead with just transition legislation in the 2023. It doesn't like to call it that anymore. But the goal, it says, is to help oil and gas workers move into newer green energy jobs. But Alberta's government says that would be a serious blow to its largest industry and that the province will manage its own resource sector. Alberta's Environment Minister Sonya joins me this morning from Calgary to talk about this. Minister, so glad of you to make the time. Thank you.
Well, thank you and good morning.
So what is your biggest concern with this legislation so far? Given it hasn't been written, they're still in a consultation period. What are your concerns?
Well, look, we all share the same goals, the federal government and the provincial government, to reduce emissions, to address climate change, and that means reducing emissions across all sectors, including oil and gas. We share those same goals. But what we don't agree on is calling this the just transition or trying to place this into a massive framework, federal government framework called the just transition. And we certainly don't agree with the federal government bringing in yet another piece of federal legislation called the Just Transition Act. The problem with the just transition, it's a polarizing term, and they've been using it for a long time. And I know they're walking away from it a bit and they're starting to call it sustainable jobs.
Yeah.
But if they're talking about something different than the just transition, they should scrub their government websites and all their consultation pieces of the term, because just transition means something, and it's an international phrase, and it means something to the international community, to climate justice organizations, some international organizations, and it means phasing out fossil fuels immediately, keeping it in the ground. And even more than that, it means restructuring societies and economies and redistributing wealth. And for Alberta, it's a non-starter to start talking about a just transition.
Okay, so it's to your point that the government seems to have recognized that phrase could be triggering or upsetting to you. And so, as you say, Minister Wilkinson's starting to use the language sustainable jobs. But in terms of the meat of what is there, the minister also seems to suggest that you're pretty much on the same page, and that oil and gas would not be the end or the death of oil and gas, but that this is an opening for thousands of new jobs. What do you say to that notion, that you're actually not that far apart on some of the central points of what he wants to see in the legislation?
Well, we have to see what comes in the legislation. Sure. If they don't back away from that international terminology, we know what we're going to see in the legislation, and it's all the international terms and restructuring of economies and phasing out fossil fuels. But you're right, we are working very closely with them on technologies, things like carbon capture, utilization, and storage, hydrogen. We're working with them on critical minerals and attracting investment in some of the new and growing and emerging areas in the economy. And in that part, we're working quite well together. But we don't need to wind all of that up and package it up into the just transition framework. We need to continue working together, and we need to start doing things more like what they're doing in the United States, and not calling it just transition. But the United States is bringing in the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's offering over $300 billion of incentives to make the United States competitive, to attract investment. They have to start using that sort of terminology out of Ottawa to help attracting investment. And we need to hear more from them, that oil and gas is part of the future, and they're trying to attract investment into oil and gas and to reducing emissions in oil and gas.
You, of course, before were the energy minister, and I know the premier is relatively new. She said on her radio show yesterday that she hadn't really heard anything about this from the prime minister. I imagine, though, you have been engaged in conversations in your previous role and in this one. Has Alberta, or is Alberta, formally participating in those conversations and consultations to try and get some of what you're talking about on the federal government's radar?
Well, not really. They launched consultations, I think it was the summer of 2021, for the just transition legislation and putting together a framework. They've concluded part of that, and they're still underway. Consultations are underway I know they tried to put together some roundtables, regional roundtables, to work with provinces. The problem with the roundtables they were putting together at that time is it wasn't aligned with the purposes that the province of Alberta was looking for. We're looking at attracting investment, lowering emissions, making oil and gas competitive. But the framework of these roundtables was all about cooperating on the just transition. They hadn't walked away from the language. In fact, they were pulling the provinces into a massive framework to enable and facilitate the just transition. And once they start scrubbing the government websites and the wording of that out of their consultations, it'll be easier to have these conversations. But I will say we're doing a lot of good work in the background, especially on CCUS, hydrogen. There's a lot of good work underway. And I think what gets lost in all of the back and forth between the federal government and the provincial government is the fact that Alberta is actually leading the way on a lot of climate change initiatives, on a lot of emission reducing technology. We're actually leading the way on things like methane emissions, on hydrogen, carbon capture. That gets lost in all of this. But we have to start talking a little bit more sensibly, the federal government, and just move off of this divisive, polarizing language.
Would the Alberta Sovereignty Act, which was the first piece of legislation passed by the government, by the new premier, would that have a role to play here if you don't see legislation that fits into what Alberta needs and what you want?
Well, I think if the government steps across the jurisdictional line with any of the legislation, number one, that would be a constitutional challenge. Right. And we've already done that with Bill C-69, have a successful, very decisive and strong decision out of the Alberta Court of Appeal striking down Bill C-69. We would definitely work with that on anything that interferes with our jurisdiction. We'll protect our oil and gas industry and the workers, men and women working in it. But behind the scenes, I think a better approach is to work together to attract investment, to make sure our economies remain competitive, to make sure our oil and gas sector is able to continue attracting investment, because they're the ones that are going to be paying for and bringing in the technology to bring in new sources of energy, lower carbon energy.
Just finally, Minister, as well as the change in language, which I've totally heard you on, would money be an important part of this? It's my understanding that will be a package that would be offered for transition. And what would you be looking for the federal government in terms of investments?
Well, part of it depends on what the federal government means by transition. Of course, we want to see incentives to attract investment. Right. But if what they're talking about doing is retraining workers and helping communities where resources are developed to find different sources of income, that's not going to cut it. In Alberta, we sit on top of the third largest reserves of oil on the planet. If what Ottawa is talking about, and they repeatedly say it's not, but if what they intend in the short term or the long term is to have a government-forced shutdown of oil and gas in the province, they're not going to only have to compensate workers and communities, they're going to have to compensate the people of Alberta for 180 billion barrels of reserves of oil in the ground because it belongs to us, and a forced shutdown would be an expropriation. So they better come with a pretty big check if that's their plan. We're happy to continue working with them on emission-reducing technologies and bringing in new industries and diversification. But we have to start walking away from that polarizing language of just transition and phasing out oil and gas and capping emissions.
Minister Sonya Savage, nice to see you this Sunday morning. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you.